A quiet warning hides behind the kindest people you will ever meet. The world often celebrates strength that is loud, aggressive, and impossible to ignore. But there is another kind of strength that rarely gets attention. It belongs to the people who listen when nobody else listens. The people who stay when everyone else walks away. The people who carry the emotional weight of others without asking for anything in return. These people are called empaths. Most people see their kindness and assume they are weak. They see their patience and mistake it for helplessness. They see their forgiveness and think it has no limits. That is where many people make a serious mistake, because there is a side of an empath that remains hidden until they have been pushed too far. An empath can forgive again and again. They can understand behavior that others would never tolerate. They can see pain behind cruelty. They can see wounds behind anger. They can spend years trying to heal relationships that should have ended long ago. They often give more chances than anyone deserves. But every act of patience comes with a cost. Every disappointment leaves a mark. Every betrayal adds another crack beneath the surface. And while it may seem like an empath can endure anything, the truth is far more complex. There comes a moment when the person who cared the most reaches their limit. There comes a moment when the heart that kept giving decides it can no longer carry the burden. And when that moment arrives, the consequences can be far more brutal than most people expect. Not because the empath becomes cruel, not because they seek revenge. The real consequence is much deeper than that. It is a transformation that changes relationships forever. It is a shift that many people fail to recognize until it is too late. In this video, you will discover why empaths tolerate more than most people, the hidden emotional damage they carry in silence, the warning signs that an empath is reaching their breaking point, and the surprising reason why losing an empath often creates regret that lasts for years. You will also learn what actually happens inside the mind of an empath after repeated betrayal and why the version of them that once gave endless chances rarely returns. Some of these truths are rarely discussed, yet they explain why certain relationships suddenly collapse after years of seeming stability. By the end of this video, you may never look at kindness, patience, or emotional strength in the same way again. So stay with us until the very end, because the final lesson may completely change how you understand empaths and the people who quietly hold the emotional world together. Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy deep psychological insights, powerful life lessons, and eye-opening truths about human behavior, make sure to subscribe and join our growing community. Now, let's begin. There is a reason empaths tolerate behavior that most people would walk away from much earlier. It is not because they are blind. It is not because they are weak. And it is certainly not because they enjoy being treated badly. The truth is much deeper than that. An empath experiences people differently. While most people focus on what someone does, an empath often focuses on why they do it. They look beyond harsh words and see pain. They look beyond bad behavior and see fear. They look beyond anger and see wounds that may have been carried for years. This ability allows them to connect with people on a level that many others never reach. They can sense emotional struggles that remain hidden from everyone else. They notice sadness behind a smile. They notice loneliness behind confidence. They notice insecurity behind arrogance. Because of this, they often become the person everyone turns to when life becomes difficult. An empath understands that people are not perfect. They understand that trauma can change how a person behaves. They understand that painful experiences can leave scars that affect relationships for years. They understand that many people are fighting battles nobody else can see. This understanding makes them compassionate. It makes them patient. It makes them willing to stay when others leave. But this gift comes with a hidden danger, because when you can see the pain behind someone's actions, it becomes easier to excuse behavior that should never be accepted. An empath may tell themselves that the person is just hurting. They may believe that things will improve with enough love and support. They may convince themselves that another chance will make a difference. This is why empaths often forgive far more than they should. They forgive broken promises. They forgive disrespect. They forgive neglect. They forgive emotional wounds that continue happening again and again. While others see clear warning signs, the empath keeps searching for reasons to stay. They focus on potential instead of reality. They focus on who a person could become rather than who they are right now. They hold on to hope even when the evidence suggests they should let go. Many people admire this level of compassion. It looks noble. It looks beautiful. It looks strong. But sometimes it becomes the very thing that causes the deepest pain. An empath often believes that every person deserves understanding. They believe that patience can heal. They believe that love can inspire change. And while these beliefs come from a good place, they can slowly trap the empath in situations that drain them emotionally. They keep giving because they remember the good moments. They keep trying because they see hidden potential. They keep believing because giving up feels like abandoning someone who needs help. What many people fail to realize is that an empath rarely stops caring overnight. Long before they leave, they have usually spent months or even years trying to save a relationship, repair a friendship, or hold together a connection that has already begun falling apart. Many people only see the empath's kindness. They do not see the internal struggle. They do not see the countless times the empath questioned themselves. They do not see the emotional weight being carried every single day. They only see someone who continues showing up, someone who continues giving, someone who continues understanding. What they fail to understand is that every act of understanding requires emotional energy. Every act of forgiveness requires emotional energy. Every act of support requires emotional energy. And emotional energy is not unlimited. An empath's greatest strength often becomes their greatest weakness. The same compassion that allows them to love deeply can also cause them to stay too long. The same understanding that helps them connect with people can also prevent them from protecting themselves. The same patience that makes them supportive can also make them vulnerable to repeated disappointment. While everyone around them benefits from their emotional generosity, the empath quietly pays the price. Over time, that price becomes heavier and heavier. This is where the invisible damage begins. Most people never notice it because empaths are experts at hiding their own pain. They become so focused on helping others that they forget how to help themselves. They become so focused on listening that nobody notices they need someone to listen to them too. They become so focused on solving other people's problems that their own emotional needs slowly disappear into the background. Day after day, they absorb stress, negativity, frustration, and emotional chaos. They become emotional shelters for people who need support. They become safe places for people who need understanding. But while everyone finds relief through the empath often finds nowhere to unload their own burden. This creates a quiet exhaustion that grows slowly over time. It does not arrive all at once. It builds little by little. One disappointment here, one betrayal there, one broken promise after another. Each experience may seem small by itself, but eventually they begin stacking on top of each other. The weight becomes impossible to ignore. The empath starts feeling tired in ways that sleep cannot fix. Their mind becomes crowded with other people's emotions. Their heart becomes heavy from carrying responsibilities that were never theirs to begin with. The outside world rarely notices these changes. The empath still smiles. They still help. They still listen. They still show kindness. But beneath the surface, cracks are beginning to form. Emotional fatigue starts replacing enthusiasm. Frustration starts replacing optimism. A quiet sadness begins settling into places that were once filled with hope. The empath may not even realize what is happening at first. They simply feel drained. They feel overwhelmed. They feel emotionally stretched beyond their limits. As this continues, another emotion begins to appear: resentment. Not because the empath suddenly becomes selfish, not because they stop caring. Resentment appears because they start noticing the imbalance. They start realizing that they are always giving but rarely receiving. They are always understanding but rarely understood. They are always supporting but rarely supported. They begin recognizing that many people have grown comfortable taking their kindness for granted. This realization is painful because empaths genuinely want to believe the best about people. They want to believe their efforts matter. They want to believe their sacrifices are appreciated. Yet reality slowly reveals a different picture. The empath starts noticing who only calls when they need something. They start noticing who disappears when support is needed in return. They start noticing who values their kindness but never values them. These realizations cut deeply because empaths invest emotionally in the people they care about. Relationships are never casual to them. Their energy is personal. Their support is personal. Their love is personal. Every disappointment feels heavier because of how deeply they care. Most people only see the empath's patience. They never see the silent suffering behind it. They never see the nights spent overthinking conversations. They never see the emotional exhaustion hidden behind a calm face. They never see the tears that remain private. They never see the internal battles fought in complete silence. They see someone who appears strong. What they do not see is someone who has been carrying emotional weight for far too long. And eventually the pressure becomes too much. There comes a moment when the empath reaches a place they never expected to reach. A place where understanding is no longer enough. A place where patience is no longer enough. A place where hope begins running out. This moment does not arrive with dramatic arguments. It does not arrive with shouting. It does not arrive with revenge. In fact, the most important change often happens quietly. The empath begins detaching emotionally. At first, the change is almost invisible. They stop explaining themselves as much. They stop fighting for every relationship. They stop trying to fix every problem. The energy that once flowed naturally begins disappearing. The endless effort begins slowing down. The person who once carried everyone else's emotional burdens starts putting those burdens down one by one. This is not anger. This is not hatred. This is not revenge. It is disappointment. Deep disappointment. The kind of disappointment that comes after giving everything and realizing it still was not enough. The kind of disappointment that appears when years of effort produce the same painful results. The kind of disappointment that forces a person to face a truth they have been avoiding for a very long time. The empath finally realizes that no amount of love can save someone who refuses to change. This realization changes everything. For years they believed more understanding would help, more patience would help, more sacrifice would help, more love would help. But now they understand that change must come from the other person. Growth cannot be forced. Healing cannot be forced. Responsibility cannot be forced. No matter how deeply an empath cares, they cannot carry another person's life forever. This is the moment hope dies. And when hope dies, everything changes. Because hope was the reason they stayed. Hope was the reason they forgave. Hope was the reason they endured disappointment after disappointment. Once hope disappears, the foundation holding everything together begins to collapse. The empath stops waiting for promises to become reality. They stop believing that one more chance will create a different outcome. They stop sacrificing themselves for people who have no intention of changing. And the transformation that follows is often far more powerful than anyone around them realizes. What happens next is the part most people never see coming. They expect anger. They expect confrontation. They expect dramatic goodbyes and emotional explosions. But that is usually not what happens when an empath reaches their limit. The final stage is often much quieter. In fact, it can be so quiet that people completely miss it until the damage is already done. The empath begins to withdraw, not temporarily, not as a way to gain attention, not as a tactic to make someone feel guilty. They withdraw emotionally, completely. The person who once responded immediately becomes distant. The person who once checked on everyone stops reaching out. The person who once carried the emotional weight of entire relationships suddenly puts that weight down. For a long time, the empath was the one holding everything together. They were the one starting difficult conversations. They were the one trying to repair misunderstandings. They were the one making excuses for behavior that should never have been excused. They were the one searching for solutions when everyone else was creating problems. But now that effort begins to disappear, the chasing stops, the fixing stops, the rescuing stops. This change can feel shocking to the people around them because they have become so used to the empath's endless effort. They assumed it would always be there. They assumed the empath would always forgive. They assumed there would always be another chance waiting for them. What they fail to understand is that the empath was not operating from an unlimited source of energy. Every act of kindness required something. Every sacrifice required something. Every disappointment took something away, and eventually there is nothing left to give. The empath reaches a point where they can no longer pour from an empty cup. They can no longer sacrifice their own peace to maintain relationships that continue draining them. So they stop. At first, people often mistake this for a temporary phase. They assume the empath is just upset. They assume a little time will fix everything. They assume things will go back to normal. But what they do not realize is that the empath has already spent months, sometimes years, trying to save what was falling apart. The decision to emotionally withdraw is rarely impulsive. It is usually the final result of countless disappointments, repeated betrayals, ignored boundaries, and broken trust. By the time the empath finally lets go, they have already exhausted every reason they had to stay. The most brutal thing an empath can do is become indifferent. Not because indifference is cruel, not because indifference is aggressive, but because indifference represents the end of emotional investment. It means the connection that once mattered deeply no longer has access to their heart. It means the emotional door that remained open through countless disappointments has finally closed. Many people fear anger because anger is uncomfortable, but anger still contains emotion. Anger still contains energy. Anger still contains connection. Indifference is different. Indifference means the emotional connection is gone. This is why the change feels so shocking. The empath who once cared deeply no longer argues. They no longer beg. They no longer explain themselves endlessly. They no longer try to convince people to value them. They simply stop investing energy where it is no longer appreciated. The conversations become shorter. The emotional availability disappears. The effort disappears. The urgency disappears. What remains is a calm distance that many people struggle to understand. For the first time, the empath stops carrying responsibility for everyone else's happiness. They stop solving problems that are not theirs to solve. They stop feeling guilty for protecting themselves. And while this transformation brings peace to the empath, it often creates confusion for everyone else. The people who benefited from the empath's endless patience suddenly find themselves standing alone with the consequences of their own behavior. And once that happens, getting them back becomes almost impossible. This is the stage where regret begins to appear. It usually does not happen immediately. At first, many people continue assuming the empath will return. They believe another apology will fix everything. They believe another promise will reopen the door. They believe things can simply go back to the way they were. But as time passes, reality becomes harder to ignore. The empath is no longer there. The support is no longer there. The understanding is no longer there. The absence becomes impossible to miss. People start noticing small things first. They notice there is nobody checking on them anymore. Nobody reminding them they matter. Nobody listening patiently to their problems. Nobody offering comfort during difficult moments. The emotional safety they once took for granted suddenly disappears. And for the first time, they begin to understand the value of what they lost. Many people do not recognize an empath's importance while they still have access to it. Kindness can become invisible when it is always available. Loyalty can become expected when it is given freely. Understanding can become overlooked when it is constantly present. Human nature often causes people to appreciate things only after they are gone. The empath's presence becomes one of those things. People often miss an empath only after the silence arrives. The silence reveals everything. It reveals how much support the empath was providing. It reveals how much emotional stability they were creating. It reveals how much energy they were investing behind the scenes. Suddenly, there is nobody smoothing over conflicts, nobody offering endless patience. Nobody creating emotional comfort during difficult times. The space they occupied becomes painfully obvious. For some people, this realization creates deep regret. They replay conversations in their minds. They remember opportunities they wasted. They remember moments when they took kindness for granted. They remember times they ignored boundaries, dismissed feelings, or assumed forgiveness would always be available. The things that once seemed small begin looking very different through the lens of loss. Many people spend years searching for another person who offers the same level of understanding and compassion. But genuine empathy is rare. Real emotional generosity is rare. Authentic loyalty is rare. And once it disappears, replacing it becomes far more difficult than people expect. The painful truth is that some losses cannot be reversed. Some doors close permanently. Some relationships reach a point where there is no way back. Yet the deepest consequence does not belong to the people who lost the empath. The deepest consequence affects the empath too. Because after enough pain, an empath changes. Not overnight, not dramatically, but permanently. The person who emerges from repeated heartbreak is not the same person who entered it. Years of disappointment teach lessons that cannot be unlearned. The empath begins seeing the world differently. They begin seeing relationships differently. They begin seeing themselves differently. One of the biggest changes appears in their boundaries. The empath who once allowed endless access starts becoming selective. They no longer allow everyone into their emotional world. They stop giving unlimited chances. They stop ignoring warning signs. They stop assuming good intentions are enough to build healthy relationships. Instead, they begin paying attention to actions. They begin respecting their own limits. They begin understanding that protecting their peace is not selfish. Their tolerance for manipulation becomes smaller. Their tolerance for disrespect becomes smaller. Their tolerance for emotional games becomes smaller. Experiences that once would have been excused are now recognized immediately. Behaviors that once would have been tolerated are now addressed quickly. Patterns that once would have been ignored are now impossible to overlook. This does not happen because the empath becomes cynical. It happens because experience teaches them what unchecked behavior eventually costs. Another powerful change appears in the way they value themselves. For years, many empaths measure their worth through what they can give. They feel valuable when they help. They feel valuable when they support. They feel valuable when they solve problems for others. But pain forces them to develop a different understanding. They begin realizing that their value does not depend on sacrifice. Their value does not depend on fixing people. Their value does not depend on carrying burdens that were never theirs. This realization creates a stronger sense of self-respect. The empath begins choosing relationships that feel balanced instead of one-sided. They begin choosing mutual effort instead of constant sacrifice. They begin choosing peace instead of chaos. For the first time, they understand that caring about others should never require abandoning themselves. This is where many people misunderstand the empath's transformation. They assume the empath has become cold. They assume the empath has become distant. They assume the empath has stopped caring. But the truth is very different. The empath does not become cruel. They become careful. They become wiser about where they invest their energy. They become more aware of who deserves access to their heart. They become more protective of the emotional resources they once gave away so freely. They understand that empathy without boundaries can become self-destruction. They understand that kindness without limits can attract people who only take. And they understand that self-respect is not the opposite of compassion. It is what allows compassion to survive. The person who once gave everyone access now guards their energy, not because they want to keep people out, but because they finally understand the cost of letting the wrong people in. Never mistake endless kindness for endless tolerance. Some of the most caring people in this world spend years giving chances that nobody else would give. They forgive when they should walk away. They understand when they should be understood. They keep showing up even when nobody shows up for them. Not because they are weak, but because their hearts are built differently. They see the good in people long after everyone else has stopped looking. But every empath eventually learns a painful truth. No amount of love can heal someone who refuses to heal themselves. No amount of patience can fix someone who refuses to change. And no amount of sacrifice can save a relationship where only one person is fighting for it. Empaths do not leave because they stop loving. In many cases, they still care deeply. They leave because they finally learn that choosing themselves is not selfish. It is necessary. After carrying the weight of everyone else's emotions for so long, they finally realize they deserve peace too. They deserve respect too. They deserve the same kindness they have spent years giving to others. And once they reach that realization, everything changes. The person who kept forgiving every mistake, the person who kept answering every call, the person who kept believing every promise, slowly disappears. Not because they became cold, not because they became cruel, but because they finally understood their own worth. And the version of them that accepted less than they deserved never returns. That is why breaking an empath is such a dangerous mistake. The consequence is not their revenge. The consequence is not their anger. The consequence is not some dramatic ending. It's their absence. It's the silence that replaces their support. It's the empty space where their loyalty used to be. It's realizing too late how much light they brought into your life after that light is gone. And for many people, that realization arrives when there is no way back. So if there is one lesson to remember from this video, let it be this: value good-hearted people while they are still present. Appreciate those who genuinely care. And never take consistent kindness for granted, because some people will keep giving forever. But even the biggest heart has limits. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever watched a kind and caring person completely change after being hurt too many times? Or have you experienced that transformation yourself? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this video connected with you, take a moment to like the video because it helps more people discover these powerful insights. And if you enjoy deep psychology, human behavior, emotional intelligence, and life-changing lessons like this, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Finally, share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Thank you for watching. And remember, the strongest hearts are not the ones that never break. They are the ones that learn how to protect themselves after they do. In this video, you will understand what truly defines an empath beyond surface-level explanations. It goes deeper than being sensitive or caring. It is about emotional absorption, where feelings from others are not just understood but experienced internally. You will learn how this ability, which is often seen as a gift, slowly becomes a burden when it is repeatedly taken advantage of. There is a lesser discussed pattern in human behavior, where people who feel too much are often the ones who suffer in silence the longest, because they keep adjusting themselves to avoid hurting others, even when they are the ones being hurt. As the video continues, you will see how emotional exhaustion builds quietly over time. There is no single moment where everything changes. Instead, it is a series of small emotional breaks that accumulate until something inside finally stops responding the same way. This is where most people misunderstand empaths. They assume patience means endless tolerance, but psychology shows that emotional capacity has limits. Once those limits are crossed, the brain and heart begin to disconnect from situations that once felt deeply important. You will also discover what happens after that breaking point. It is not anger and it is not revenge, it is distance, a calm and controlled emotional withdrawal that makes the person appear unchanged on the surface, but completely different on the inside. The warmth is still there, but it no longer reaches people who caused the damage. This shift is often too late for others to notice, because it does not announce itself. It simply replaces presence with silence. Stay with this video until the end, because what follows will reveal how irreversible this transformation can become, and why certain emotional boundaries, once crossed, cannot be restored to their original state. There are signs that most people ignore until the damage is already done, and understanding these signs can completely change how you see emotional relationships and human connection. If you find value in understanding the hidden side of human emotions and psychological depth, then you are in the right place. Welcome to our channel, where we explore the truth behind human behavior, emotions, and mindset in the simplest way possible. If you are new here, subscribe to the channel and stay connected, because what you are about to learn may change the way you understand people forever. An empath is not simply a person who is kind or emotionally aware. It is a deeper psychological pattern where emotions are processed with unusual intensity and immediacy. When others speak, an empath does not only hear the words, but also picks up the emotional weight behind them. The tone, the hesitation, the silence between sentences, all of it gets absorbed internally. Empaths feel everything deeply in a way that makes emotional boundaries less defined. Joy does not stay outside of them, and neither does pain. It enters, settles, and becomes part of their internal state for a period of time. Because of this, they often experience emotional overload in environments where most people remain unaffected. They absorb emotions from others without consciously choosing to do so, which means the stress, sadness, frustration, or even anger of people around them can slowly become part of their own emotional experience. This is not something they can easily switch off, and over time it becomes exhausting. They care even when it hurts them, and this is one of the most misunderstood parts of their nature. Caring for them is not a decision that depends on convenience or comfort. It is an automatic response. Even when they are drained, even when they are emotionally empty, they still find themselves concerned about others. They continue to show up, continue to listen, and continue to give emotional space to people who may not even realize how much it costs them internally. This kind of emotional behavior is not driven by obligation, but by a deep internal wiring that makes detachment feel unnatural. Forgiveness also comes too easily for them. Even when they are hurt repeatedly, they tend to see intention, context, or emotional background, instead of focusing only on the damage. This creates a cycle where they return to situations that are already harming them, believing that understanding and patience can fix what is broken. Over time, this pattern becomes a silent burden they carry, without expressing it openly. They do not just understand pain, they feel it as their own. This is what separates an empath from someone who is simply emotionally intelligent. Understanding pain allows distance, but feeling it removes that distance completely. When someone close to them suffers, they experience a reflection of that suffering internally. It is almost as if emotional boundaries blur, and the pain of others becomes temporarily shared. This creates a powerful sense of connection, but it also creates vulnerability. Because when pain is shared too deeply and too often, it does not remain harmless. It accumulates, and while they may appear calm on the outside, inside there is a constant processing of emotional weight that rarely gets released fully. Over time, this leads into a silent struggle that is rarely visible to others. Empaths often get used, drained, and ignored without immediate recognition of the damage being done. Because they do not react loudly, people assume they are fine. Because they do not complain early, others assume they are strong enough to handle anything. This misunderstanding becomes the foundation of their silent suffering. They stay quiet to avoid conflict, not because they lack opinions or feelings, but because conflict feels emotionally expensive to them. Every argument, every confrontation, every emotional imbalance creates internal stress that they would rather avoid. So instead of speaking up, they adjust themselves. They shrink their needs, reduce their expectations, and make themselves easier to deal with, just to maintain peace in their surroundings. They keep giving even when they are empty. This is one of the most draining cycles in their emotional life. Even when their internal energy is depleted, they still respond to the needs of others. They still show empathy, still offer support, still try to understand what others are going through, even when no one is doing the same for them. This creates a one-sided emotional flow where they are constantly pouring out without receiving anything in return. Over time, this imbalance becomes normalized in their life, and they start believing that this is simply how relationships work. People around them begin to depend on their emotional availability without realizing that it comes at a cost. At the same time, kindness becomes misunderstood. People often mistake their patience for permission because they do not react aggressively, because they do not shut people out immediately. Others begin to assume that their boundaries are flexible. Small violations of respect turn into repeated patterns. Emotional needs of others start taking priority over their own, and their silence is interpreted as acceptance. This is where the silent struggle deepens. Not because they are unaware, but because they are constantly choosing to understand instead of react. Each time they choose understanding over confrontation, a small internal shift happens that slowly builds emotional fatigue. There comes a moment in their life when something inside can no longer continue at the same pace. It is not a dramatic breakdown, and it does not look like sudden emotional explosion. Instead, it is a quiet internal shift that changes how they respond to everything around them. The effort to explain themselves begins to fade. Conversations that once mattered deeply start feeling unnecessary. Where there was once emotional engagement, there is now observation. They stop chasing clarity from people who never tried to understand them in the first place. The energy they once used to maintain emotional connections begins to disappear, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion that has reached its limit. They begin to detach emotionally without making it obvious. On the surface, they may still interact, still respond, still remain present in physical terms, but internally, something fundamental has changed. Emotional investment is no longer automatic. Where they once gave understanding freely, they now pause and evaluate whether it is even worth giving. The desire to fix, to explain, to rescue emotional situations begins to weaken. This is not a reaction driven by revenge or resentment. It is a protective withdrawal that forms naturally when emotional capacity has been exceeded for too long. At this stage, they stop explaining themselves. The need to be understood loses importance compared to the need to preserve their remaining emotional energy. Conversations that require repeated justification feel unnecessary. They no longer feel the urge to convince others of their intentions or feelings. Instead, silence becomes their default response to emotional confusion. They stop chasing people who are not meeting them halfway. This does not happen because they suddenly stop caring, but because caring without balance becomes unsustainable. Their emotional system begins to prioritize self-preservation over connection. The shift is subtle but powerful. They start observing people more than engaging with them. Instead of reacting immediately, they begin to pause and process. This creates a distance that others can feel but often cannot explain. Their presence remains, but the emotional warmth that once defined them becomes less accessible. It is still there, but no longer freely available to everyone. Trust becomes selective. Access becomes limited. Emotional energy is no longer distributed equally. It is reserved, protected, and carefully managed. What makes this transformation so significant is that it does not announce itself. There is no warning sign that clearly marks the moment when everything changes. From the outside, everything may appear normal for a while, but internally, the emotional structure has already shifted. The person is no longer operating from the same place of openness they once had. The internal decision to stop overextending themselves has already been made quietly. And once that decision is made, it slowly begins to reshape how they respond to every situation moving forward. It is not anger that defines this stage, it is absence. After the internal breaking point is crossed, the change does not announce itself in a loud or visible way. There is no sudden emotional explosion that others can easily point to. Instead, what begins to form is a quiet distance that slowly replaces familiarity. The same person who once responded instantly, cared deeply, and stayed emotionally available starts to feel different in presence, even if their actions still appear polite and normal on the surface. Emotional distance becomes their new state of balance. It is not created out of hatred or resentment, but out of a long period of emotional exhaustion where giving more started to feel like losing more. The energy that once flowed freely toward people, situations, and emotional problems begins to retract inward. They stop extending themselves into spaces where their effort was not matched, and this change is not temporary. It becomes a stable shift in how they engage with the world around them. They no longer overgive, and this is one of the most noticeable transformations in their behavior. Before this stage, their natural instinct was to fill emotional gaps, to help, to explain, to support even when it was not requested. But after the breaking point, that instinct weakens significantly. They begin to recognize patterns instead of reacting to them emotionally. Where they once rushed to fix misunderstandings or repair emotional distance, they now pause. They evaluate whether their energy is even being received or respected. If the pattern of imbalance repeats, they step back instead of stepping in. This is not because they have stopped caring, but because caring without limits eventually leads to depletion. Their emotional energy becomes something they no longer distribute freely, and this shift changes how people experience them completely. They begin to observe people instead of trying to save them. This is a major internal transition. Earlier, they would enter emotional situations with the intention of understanding, fixing, or healing. They would try to carry emotional weight that was never theirs to hold. After the breaking point, their approach becomes more detached and observational. They start to notice patterns in behavior, consistency in actions, and the difference between words and reality. Instead of emotionally investing in every situation, they begin to step back mentally and assess it from a distance. This does not mean they become cold, it means they become aware. They no longer confuse emotional intensity with emotional sincerity. They begin to understand that not every situation requires their involvement, and not every person benefits from their emotional support. They also become significantly harder to manipulate, and this is where the transformation becomes most visible to others. Before, their empathy made them open, forgiving, and emotionally responsive. People who understood this often took advantage of their willingness to understand and stay patient. But after the breaking point, emotional manipulation no longer works the same way. They begin to recognize emotional patterns that repeat without change. They notice when guilt is being used as a tool, when silence is being used as control, and when emotional pressure is being applied to force reactions. Instead of responding emotionally, they start responding with distance. The emotional hooks that once influenced them no longer create the same effect. This creates a barrier that cannot easily be crossed because it is not built on anger but on clarity. They still feel deeply, but they no longer stay where they are not valued. This contrast defines everything that follows. Their emotional depth does not disappear. They still experience emotions strongly, still understand people on a deep level, still notice things others miss. But the direction of that emotional depth changes completely. Instead of being directed outward without restriction, it becomes selective. They begin to differentiate between people who respect their presence and people who only benefit from it. Emotional connection is no longer automatic. It becomes conditional on mutual respect and emotional balance. This shift creates a new version of them that is both emotionally aware and emotionally protected. As this transformation settles in, a realization begins to form in the environment around them. People who were once used to their availability start noticing the absence of it. At first, it feels temporary. Others assume they will return to their previous state of emotional openness because that is what always happened before. But this time, something is different. The calm presence that once absorbed everything without resistance becomes distant in a way that cannot easily be reached again. Their responses become minimal, their emotional reactions become measured, and their involvement becomes selective. What used to feel accessible now feels restricted, as if a boundary has been placed where there was none before. The silence they carry begins to feel heavier than their words ever did. Before, their presence was defined by understanding, explanation, and emotional engagement. Now their silence carries meaning on its own. It communicates finality without needing expression. People start to realize that the emotional space they once had with them is no longer open in the same way. Attempts to reconnect or regain previous emotional closeness often feel different, as if something fundamental has already shifted beyond repair. The connection may still exist in memory, but not in the same emotional form. What makes this stage so powerful is the realization that comes too late for many. The value of their emotional presence becomes clear only after it is no longer freely available. The calm empath, who once made emotional chaos feel manageable, becomes unreachable in the same way they once were. Their energy is no longer something others can depend on without balance or awareness. The emotional access that once felt guaranteed is no longer there, and no amount of explanation or apology easily restores it. There is a subtle truth in this transformation that becomes impossible to ignore. The loss is not just of attention or availability, it is of emotional access. Once that access is gone, the dynamic between them and others changes permanently. The version of them that once gave without limits, explained without hesitation, and stayed without conditions does not return in the same form. What remains is a person who still understands deeply, but chooses carefully where that understanding goes. There is a point in every emotional connection where words stop mattering and actions begin to define everything. When someone who feels deeply reaches their limit, the change is not loud, and it is not dramatic. It is final in a quiet way that most people only understand when it is already too late. Never push an empath to the point of no return, because the human heart does not reset itself the way people assume it does. Once emotional exhaustion replaces emotional hope, the same warmth that once held everything together does not return in its original form. Something inside shifts permanently, and the way they see people, trust people, and respond to emotional closeness is never the same again. Because when they leave emotionally, they do not come back the same person who once gave everything without limits. The connection may still exist in memory, but the emotional version of them that was open, patient, and endlessly understanding slowly disappears. What replaces it is awareness, distance, and protection. They still feel, they still understand, but they no longer offer themselves freely to situations that once drained them. The version you broke does not return, not because they are trying to punish anyone, but because they have already learned what it costs to stay where they are not valued. And that is the truth most people only realize in silence after the emotional space is already closed. The access they once had is no longer available, and no apology or realization brings back the exact version that existed before the breaking point. Emotional energy, once reshaped by pain and exhaustion, does not rebuild itself into the same form again. It evolves into something more guarded, more selective, and far more distant. Before this video ends, take a moment to reflect on this simple question. Have you ever lost someone who cared too much and only understood their value when they were no longer the same person anymore? That realization often comes late, and by the time it does, the emotional space that once existed cannot be recreated in the same way. If this video helped you understand the hidden depth of empaths and the emotional transformation they go through, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to the channel. More deep psychological and emotional content like this is coming soon, and you do not want to miss what we explore next.